Go to the Full English Show. We are live every evening, Monday through Friday, on Rumble. I'm sure you're all aware of this. This is just one of my law and legal books. The Memoirs of Granville Sharp, Esquire. This is just a fraction. The rest of it is up north somewhere in an archive. And they got someone to write this. Memoirs of Granville Sharp, Esquire, composed from his own manuscripts and other authentic documents in the possession of his family and the African institution. Edited by Prince Hore. And it goes into some detail who Prince Hore is. And he said everything was fantastic in the archives. He was honoured, deeply honoured, to be allowed access to it all, and deeply honoured to read through it all and understand everything that Granville Sharp did. That book on its own is something like 70 quid from Cambridge University Press. Average people possibly wouldn't go out and buy that, but if you really want to see the actual history in writing from the people who created it, then they're the types of books that come directly from the archive. Bearing in mind that the 3 books, and I showed you them last night, were the 3 books that I presented just in an image and said you should read these, David Lammy. That's what got me banned from Twitter. The point being, the books themselves give you a direct history of slavery. I'm pretty sick and tired of the people who were responsible for slavery in some way putting it on the white working class of England when we was actually treated worse than slaves. But this is one of the books. So this 3 books, so what you've got to imagine is I had them set out similar to this so we could clearly see the titles, and it basically went into detail of what they are. The books, Barbary Slaves, Giles Milton, there's another one I've got here somewhere and all. Giles Milton, White Gold. So there was 3 books, and the other one was the stories of Thomas Pellow, or something like that. And he was one of the people that was taken as a slave, as an 11-year-old boy, on a fishing, he was working, right, as 11 years old, on a fishing boat out of Cornwall. And him, his uncle, the boat, was raided by the Barbary pirates. They took him off, and he ended up in North Africa. But eventually, I think when he was 23 years old, he'd managed to put himself in a position, the Barbary's castle or whatever, and knew how to sail a boat, he knew how to do everything, got on a boat and went bang, and he ended up coming back to Britain, come back, knocked on his mum and dad's door and said, I'm back. They were shocked to see him, they thought they'd lost him forever. So he was like a ghost who just reappeared. And he became famous because he wrote books about being a slave to the Barbary pirates. And this whole situation and what was going on, what people don't realise is even the song, Rule Britannia Will Never Be Slaves Again, blah, 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 right? That was all written about that era. And the people was getting the ump because the government weren't doing anything, the king weren't doing anything, and a rebellion was starting to kick off to say, here, they're coming into our things. And they did it to Ireland. They took an entire village. There was nobody left. Nobody left. And it's called the Stolen Village of Baltimore in Ireland. It should have an effect on an American audience because they must understand that these Irish ladies, men, boys was all taken as slaves. The women were used as what they called concubines, which was basically in a harem. They was always obviously just being raped every day. By the way, Thomas Pellow tells that story as well because he was guarding a harem for the Sultan or whoever it was. And the Sultan was drunk and wanted access. And the women were saying, no, don't let him in. And I think it's true to say, I'll have to reread the story, that he wouldn't let him in because he couldn't prove who he was. And the Sultan got really angry and all that. But when he sobered up the next day, he basically then trusted him more because he had been protecting the concubines against other men, basically. And he wasn't. He was actually protecting the women because they was all saying, don't open the door to him. So he didn't. So in effect, then he got into more trusted positions. But this is the true story of Thomas Pellow, right? So it's the Thomas Pellow book and 2 of the other books that I sent as an image on Twitter to David Lammy when he started ranting on there about slavery and reparations and all sorts of stuff. Bearing in mind, Idi Amin's wife was one of his constituents, and the son had committed a murder and got found guilty of manslaughter, was going to get sent to prison, and ended up going back to Uganda. So look at things the right way, all right? And you've got to be as honest as you can with history. And what I say by honest as you can, you read the history and you read from what them people have actually written. So why I'm explaining that is because I was banned on Twitter with 15,000 followers, been on there since 2012, simply because I sent them books and the true story of Thomas Pellow as an image, and I basically said you should read these. I don't see why that was a bannable offence on Twitter. And in its day, Thomas Pellow made a lot of money from that book. Everybody wanted to read it. When you read the history of Thomas Pellow, you understand he became a celebrity because he had escaped them. And again, it was all backed up. His parents, there was a report that him and his, I can't remember what happened to his uncle, but I think his uncle got killed. There was also racialism, as explained in History Debunked by Simon Webb. It relates to the recognition that each emphasis is in its own culture, and that of those cultures often do not align with ours. No, I agree with that. Which is why multiculturalism will never work. Multiculturalism, really. So when we talk about England, we have become the grand tribe of England, right? And then you've got the tribe of Wales, the tribe of Scotland, the tribe of Ireland. And when tribes live together, you can get mixed, right? There's not an issue with that. And again, in the old days, some of them used to do that. Used to marry their daughter into that tribe, and then it brought the tribe closer because you started to get a cross of blood from the tribes. But the whole culture of England took some time in doing, but it did happen. So in effect, in 927. So we've been a country, one nation under God, Christian nation, for 1,096 years, right? Now, what people don't realise, for anyone who hasn't seen this, I'm going to be going through some of these stories, and one of them is very, very, very harrowing. It's to do with a ship, a slave ship. Ship Zong, it was called. The full story of it is in here. I'll briefly tell you, and then I'll go through the whole story, right? Because I think the story itself is important, not just because of the inhumanity of... It was the captain of the ship, but his orders, the ship's mate or the captain's mate or whatever, basically questioned him and said, hang on a minute, right? I'll tell you what they did. He had decided, in his own mind, if slaves died, and there was 430 slaves on this ship, from Africa going to America or the Caribbean, he had decided in his own head that the law of insurance, at sea or otherwise, it didn't matter, is if they had died in his care, and it was something like 130 of them, who had become ill and sick, if they had died in his care, then it's the ship insurance that pays the slave traders, the people who owned them, those £30 each. The insurers would have to pay that money out. And then that causes a problem for the ship owners and operators who he directly worked for. So he took a decision and said to his ship's mate, the captain's mate, right, all of these ones that are sick, bring them up 10 at a time, bound their hands, and we'll throw them overboard. Because that is the law of necessity, and we're running out of water. So to save the crew and the rest of the slaves, which are owned now by someone else, what we need to do is X. So I'm not going to go through the full story, I'm just going to be brief with it. So what they did, they brought them up 10 at a time, tied their hands and threw them overboard to drown. They're sick, injured, not well, defenceless human beings, and that's what they did. The point is, this got back to Granville Sharp and others in London. When that ship come back to England, they had them all charged for murder. What you're not being told is Granville Sharp was a working class man. Everyone, or not everyone, but some of their, these lefties and these weirdos out there say, yeah, he was the son of a deacon. He was the son of a deacon. They couldn't afford to send him to university, so they got him into an apprenticeship as a tailor, which means he had a trade and he was working as a tailor. I just want everyone to understand that. right? And the whole family used to support each other. But he had a trade, so he was a working man, and he worked in that trade. He was also educated to a large extent, but he didn't have enough education. This is the point. He taught himself law. He studied law, he taught himself law, and he was regarded as a layman, or a common lawyer, as it was known. But he couldn't present cases because they, even like today, they go, oh, yeah, no, you've got to have one of our agents in the court, right? So, again, another barrister stepped up and said, no, this is wrong, what they've done there. And they was trying to play this whole thing out, right? And I will go through the whole story. I can tell you now, it is absolutely heart-wrenching what they did. 130 people. If you want to know, did it happen recently, a similar event, I always refer back to Idi Amin and the British, again, not doing anything. And he was one of 2 black officers in the British Army at the time. There was something like 400,000 officers, not officers, sorry, men in the British Army, and there was only 2 black officers, and he was one of them. They had a problem in a particular part of Africa, and they said to him, can you go and quell this rebellion? He goes out there, don't tell anyone what he's doing, chops their heads off, gets a load of them, ties them up, throws them in the pit, gets a bulldozer, covers it over, puts the rollers over the top and says, yeah, solved your rebellion. It gets back to the British that he's done that. They've all gone bump. And the reason they didn't want to do anything because he's the only black, he's one of 2 black officers. Now, if they had acted, although over 100 people was killed in that event, if they had acted, they would have saved 400,000 lives. That's the strength of it. He ended up, and don't forget he was a Muslim, Sunnah of Muhammad, followed the Sunnah of Muhammad to the letter. He ended up getting political asylum in Saudi Arabia, which is under the control of the British, but an Islamic nation. What I'm trying to tell you is there's always been people fighting and trying to change things. You only need a handful of good people. So again, memoirs of Granville Sharp Esquire are composed from his own manuscripts and other authentic documents in the possession of his family and the African Institution, edited by Prince Hor. Now, here is just a photo. So what I'm going to do is try and blow this up. I'm going to read this out to you. This is part of his memoirs. He has written this. Now, there's some other stuff I could show you from this. He's got the original record from Virginia in the USA as a state, a colony, writing back to the British king saying, listen, we don't want any slaves. And the king was more interested in the slave trade and the economic. If I was to read it out to you, you'd go, wow. So it's nothing to do with white working class people. I'm going to say this to everyone listening to this. White working class children especially, and white working class. We were sent away to the colonies if we committed a crime. You can see this stuff. And what I played this morning from Alex Jones, you can see some of that process in America, where they started bringing out sterilisation. And if you had a criminal in your family, oh, well, we don't want any of that, so we're going to sterilise you. Because they believe that they are superior. This is a judge, by the way. I want people to understand that white working class children, and I'm going to bring up the story and show you it from Hansard, where they was actually talking in Parliament about how cruelly white working class children, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, were treated by their masters. So again, it was reference to a master. And because they didn't cost anything, I mean, a fraction of what a slave would cost, they didn't value them. They certainly didn't value white human working class life. Whereas if you had paid £30, which was the going rate for a black slave, I mean, think about £30 in the 1600s and 1700s. Just think how much money that is now. Imagine you paying that. It's a bit like if you had a robot tomorrow, a real robot, and it cost you £30,000. Would you look after it and have it serviced? Or your car? Would you look after it and all that? But if you get something for nothing or next to nothing, you tend not to look after it. And that is the way they treated white people. So I'm going to go through this. Just tell me, because I had some interesting comments on this. I'm going to read you this excerpt from Granville Sharp's book, right? Spanish regulations for the gradual enfranchisement of slaves. And there it is there, right? So let me just say, the regulations lately adopted by the Spaniards at the Havana, and I believe Havana was part of Georgia. If Christie's listening, you should probably recognise some of this. And some other places for enfranchising slaves are to the following effect. And this is a direct quote. As soon as a slave is landed, his name, price, etc. are registered in the public register, and the master is obliged by law to allow him 1 working day in every week to himself, besides Sundays. So in other words, he gets 2 days a week off. This is a black slave. Right? And as I go through this, I want to see what the comments are. So if the slave chooses to work for his master on that day, he receives the wages of a free man. And whatever he gains by his labour on that day is so secured to him by law that the master cannot deprive him of it. This is certainly a considerable step towards the abolishing absolute slavery. As soon as the slave is able to purchase another working day, the master is obliged to sell it to him proportionable price, viz. 1/5 part of the original cost, and so likewise the remaining 4 days at the same rate. As soon as the slave is able to redeem them, after which he is absolutely free. This is such encouragement to industry that even the most indolent are tempted to exert themselves. So in other words, it was the opposite to socialism, is what they're saying. They're saying, because in socialism, you're basically a slave to the state. Men who have thus worked out their freedom are inured to labour of the country and are certainly the most useful subjects that a colony can acquire. Regulations might be formed upon the same plan to encourage the industry of slaves that are already imported into the colonies, which would teach them how to maintain themselves and be useful as well as less expensive to the planter. They would by such means become members of society and have an interest in the welfare of the community, which would add greatly to the strength and security of each colony. Whereas at present the planters are in continual danger of being cut off by their slaves. The interesting one is also from Virginia. And they basically say, we don't want black slaves. We want white people. Send white people over, don't send black people. And they was basically saying that you're creating a problem for the future. Even then, they understood that there was a difference in what they was doing. I'm not saying right, wrong or ugly. I'm telling you that that's the history of it. Anyway, the thing I want to ask you, from what I've just read out, what do you think of that? Anyone got anything? I believe we have been led to believe we have our freedom and we have been encouraged to live in a similar way to those slaves. Sam, you're bang on. When you read that, what I just read out, right, when you actually read it and understand it, say if I was to go and get a job as a lorry driver and they said, oh, if you ain't got a licence, we'll do this, we'll do all your training, right? But you're tied to us for 2 years. It's not slavery, but it's similar. If you want to leave before, you have to pay them all the money back, you have to do all this, and that's basically what these people are doing. How many people buy back or can purchase more holidays from their corporation? Do you understand? That's the blueprint for it there. And this is one of the reasons why I like tradesmen and people who work for themselves. They are self-motivated to go, 1, and work, 2, to do a job. They're not part of a corporation. I can't stand working for corporations. I never could. Because basically you get idiots that are running it. And it's a bit like going back to that ship. I am going to go through that whole thing and tell you about that case. It's quite a famous one. Well, say famous. Most people now haven't heard about it. There's another particular case that I'm going to go into. So here, City of London, story switching the lens of Jonathan Strong. So I'm going to tell you this story. And I'm going to tell you the real story, not their story. There was basically a slave. He was in his early 20s and he was purchased by a lawyer, in fact, a barrister. which they don't generally tell you. And there were lots of lawyers to the British bar and judges and part of that upper echelons of society that had black slaves. This particular guy, David Lyles, I think his name was, so he was a planter, he was also a barrister at law, blah, 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 earned all his money, put it into planting and having slaves, etc. Well, he beat this slave so badly, this is in America, beat him so badly, he'd lost sight in one eye. How he did it, I don't know. This is liberty and freedom for you. He got to a ship and he'd been told, if you get to England, you're free, because you can't be a slave in England. Not Scotland, England. So, I don't know how he did it. He managed to get on a ship and he came all the way back and he got back to England, or he got to England, I should say. No one really knew where he come from. But he got to Granville Sharp and they see the state of him and took him in. And they nursed him at Granville Sharp's home. And Granville Sharp's brother was a doctor and they assisted him. But his injuries were so bad that he had to be hospitalised in hospital for 4 months, I think it is. And he was still bad when he left. And then Granville Sharp got him a job. And then whilst he was doing deliveries, well, it was quite odd to see a black person in London then. He was on a carriage and jumping off the carriage and delivering medication, round to the rich people from a pharmacy. And as he did, this guy, David Lyles, see him and said, "You belong to me," and then he sold him to a trader to take back to Barbados for the plantations. And they've captured him, and that's where the story is important. And I will go through the full story of this because, again, what I'm trying to emphasise to you, it's white working class people that are standing up for the black people, even though white working class children were being mangled up in mills, stuck up chimneys and dying, all sorts of strange things going on. In 1729, listen to this, because this is sort of to do with Charles Staples' case as well, right? In 1729, Attorney General Sir Philip Yorke and the Solicitor General Charles Talbot were lobbied by West Indian plantation owners to reconsider the early judgments on the status of enslaved people in England. Now, the early judgments in common law was you cannot be a slave in England. You can be a villain or tied to the land, but you cannot be a slave. The resulting Yorke-Talbot opinion concluded that there could be no freedom for enslaved people by setting foot in Britain, nor by being baptised as they had previously been considered. Now, the wording of this has been changed from the reality. The reality, it was England and English law, and the common law. There were slaves that landed in Scotland, and the Scots basically said, no, you're still a slave, you're in Scotland. You're not in England. We've got a different legal system. The resulting, so again, previously be considered, right? So a court case in 1767 brought by Jonathan Strong and supported by the abolitionist Granville Sharp profoundly challenged this judgment. Jonathan Strong was baptised at St Leonard's, Shoreditch on 22nd of July 1765. He had been brought to London from Barbados, where he had been enslaved by planter David Lyell, where in London, Jonathan was attacked by Lyell and thrown onto the street. His injuries were so severe that he spent months in St Bartholomew's Hospital. Jonathan survived when, with the help of Granville Sharp, he was able to find work with apothecary, whatever that means. 2 years later, in 1767, Lyell happened to see Jonathan in the street, arranged for his recapture and sold him to a Jamaican planter called James Kerr for £30. Jonathan was lodged in Poultry Camper prison until he could be put on board a ship ready to sail for the Caribbean. Luckily, he was able to get word to Granville Sharp. Now, he actually spoke to one of the jailers. The jailer knew Granville Sharp and he paid him and said, "Can you help me and get this message to Granville Sharp?" So Jonathan was lodged in there. Luckily, he was able to get word to Granville Sharp, who demanded that the case be heard before the Lord Mayor. On the 18th of September 1767, Lord Mayor of London, Sir Rupert Kite, ruled that the lad had not stolen anything and was not guilty of any offence and was therefore at liberty to go away. Although the law had not been changed as a result, the judgment was significant because it ruled that Jonathan Strong's seizure under habeas corpus, the threat of his forced deportation, had been unlawful. We do not know anything about Jonathan's life beyond this case. Actually, there is a bit more to this, except for the fact that his death was recorded in the diary of Granville Sharp on the 17th of April 1773. Jonathan was only 25 years old and had never fully recovered from the beating he received at the hands of law. And so don't forget who he is. So his owner is a barrister. Now, why am I saying this to you? Because they're projecting all this racism and slavery and all that is down to white working class people. Like, fuck it was. Black slaves were treated far better in England. And again, if you got to England, you was free, but then you had to work. And if you didn't have a trade, you could just be a labourer. They'd pay you a couple of shillings a week, whatever. You could go and work. There was also so many of them. They called them I'll have to go through my diaries of events. They called them the Blackbirds of some area in London because they gathered there to beg black people who had got to England to be free. Now, all of a sudden, they weren't being looked after anymore. They didn't have a trade. They may have spoke English, but possibly not very well, and they certainly wasn't literate. So they was begging. They knew who Granville Sharp was. So Granville Sharp and these merry men turned around and said to these people, where'd you... And they all said, we want to go back home, where we were stolen from. So remember the story of Thomas Pellow, who was a white slave. And when he finally escaped, he had the wherefore or whatever. He knew how to sail a ship and he got back to England. So there's an instinct. He was 11 years old, but he knew he'd come from England. He knew roughly the sea. He'd been out as a fisherman, 11 years old. He knew that he could get back there. So what I'm saying is, compare the two stories. They both have the instinct, I want to go on. Lucky enough, the 11-year-old white kid knew he come from Cornwall, found his parents again, etc. Africa is a massive, massive, massive place. And the tribes in Africa were selling, which, by the way, was illegal in England, from 690, I think it was, and it was from the King of Kent. It predated, if you want to call it that, it predated England, and it was the Kingdom of Kent. And them laws were brought into English law, and you could not sell a villager into slavery, and you couldn't have a slave. And if you did sell a villager into slavery, you paid, your penance was you paid your weight in gold. So it was certainly not worth doing it. For whatever you would have received for the slave, it certainly wouldn't have been your weight in gold. So the thing that people need to understand about all this is two guys. So many of the blacks were told in America, and again, American colonies were saying to the British, we don't want any slaves. If I go back to and I am going to go through this again in more detail, if you go back to the petition from Virginia, which was a petition to the King George, said, listen, we don't want them here. And he went through all of the problems. We don't want you to do that. So a black slave and a white slave, but their instinct is to go back home. The problem they had with the slaves in London, and in particular London, and by the way, they was all over English shores, the problem they had with them, they didn't know where they come from in Africa. So Granville Sharp and others raised the money to go to Sierra Leone and create, I keep calling it Freeport, it might be something else, it's in this book. Basically, he created this area, and then they hired ships, they took these people, they put them down there, they taught them how to farm, they taught them animal husbandry, they taught them how to make flour and bread and everything. They taught them everything they needed to know to survive. And they didn't abandon them completely, but they still assisted them and give them any assistance that they needed in that area. So they still wanted to go to Africa, where they knew they would be there. And I sent out on Twitter today some comment. It weren't to me, it was to someone else. I'm sure it was something to do with, I sent a tweet out anyway, I can't remember what run off. But basically what it was, I said back in the tweet, listen, you're talking about these countries and all that, and they're saying, oh, well, black people and these people and these people, they're citizens of the British and all that. And I said, hang on a minute. I said, no one's saying they're not, right? But you do understand, right? And I do want people to understand this, that Liberia, oh, that's what it was about, the tweet. Someone had put a tweet out and said, it's not racist for me to say, why have we got an Indian Prime Minister, an Indian First Minister, or a Pakistani Prime Minister, and he went through the list of these people. Why are they anything to do with governance? Someone had said that's a racist comment. And it isn't racist. It's a valid question when you look at what's going on, and then you look at other countries in Africa that are actually saying, you couldn't be Prime Minister as a white person in Liberia because you are not a citizen, and you cannot be a citizen unless you're black. That's it. So where all this weirdness is coming from, and this, it's almost as if someone's trying to send you mad. Do you all understand what I'm saying by this as well? All I'm saying is, listen, I ain't got a problem with anyone who knows me. Knows I ain't got a problem with black people, brown people, yellow people, whatever, right? I go on their character. If they're acting like a see you next Tuesday, I probably ain't going to like them. It's as simple as that. But if they're nice to me, and there's no alternative motive around them or what they're doing, I ain't got a problem with it.